When most people pick up a Bible, they might assume it's a perfect copy of an original book, unchanged and preserved exactly as it was first written. The familiar pages, the comforting words, and the sense of continuity can make it easy to believe that what we hold today is a direct link to the earliest days of Christianity. But the truth is far more complex, and in many ways even more fascinating. The Bible, as we know it, is the result of centuries of careful transmission, translation, and preservation, involving countless individuals across different cultures and eras. We don't possess the original writings or autographs of the New Testament authors. Instead, what survives are manuscripts, hand-copied documents painstakingly reproduced by scribes, often centuries after the originals were composed. Each copy was vulnerable to human error, intentional changes, and the challenges of preserving fragile materials over time. Among the thousands of surviving manuscripts, 3 stand out as especially significant: Codex Alexandrinus, Codex Vaticanus, and Codex Sinaiticus. These are often referred to as the Big Three of biblical manuscripts, and they form the backbone of modern New Testament scholarship. These codices were written on vellum, specially prepared animal skin, and feature uncial script, a style of large, rounded Greek letters. Dating from the 4th and 5th centuries, they were created more than 1,000 years before the invention of the printing press, making them some of the oldest and most complete witnesses to the biblical text. Codex Vaticanus, housed in the Vatican Library, is the oldest and perhaps the most esteemed of the 3. It contains nearly the entire Bible in Greek, and its careful script and preservation have made it a cornerstone for biblical studies. Codex Sinaiticus, discovered in the 19th century at St. Catherine's Monastery in the Sinai Peninsula, is remarkable for being the only one of the 3 to contain the complete New Testament. Its dramatic discovery and subsequent study have shed new light on the early Christian text. Codex Alexandrinus, the youngest of the trio, was the first to become widely available in Western Europe. Its arrival in the West opened new doors for scholars and played a crucial role in the development of biblical criticism and translation. While these manuscripts agree on the vast majority of the text, they also contain thousands of differences, ranging from minor spelling variations to more significant textual changes. These differences prompt an important question: what did the New Testament originally say? The quest to answer this question continues to drive scholars today as they compare, analyze, and piece together the story of the Bible's transmission through the ages. The stories behind the discovery of these ancient manuscripts are as fascinating and mysterious as the texts themselves. Each manuscript has its own unique journey, shaped by centuries of history, secrecy, and scholarly pursuit. Imagine the thrill of uncovering a document that had been hidden away for generations, its pages holding secrets from the distant past. When the translators of the King James Bible began their monumental work in the early 1600s, they used the oldest manuscripts that date back to the Apostles, manuscripts preserved by early Christian groups. These were the resources available to them. They worked tirelessly, often by candlelight, poring over the manuscripts they could access. However, many of the newer and supposed significant ancient texts had not yet been discovered or made available to Western scholars, which would later prove a blessing in disguise. For example, the Codex Alexandrinus, one of the oldest and most complete Greek Bibles, only arrived in England in 1627, several years after the King James Version had already been published. Its arrival marked part of the means used by those opposed to the Reformation. It was a turning point in biblical scholarship against the Protestant Reformation, but it was too late to influence the translation. The Codex Vaticanus, another invaluable manuscript, had been housed in the Vatican Library since 1475. Yet, for centuries, it remained inaccessible to most scholars outside the Vatican. It wasn't until the late 19th century that researchers were finally granted access, opening up new avenues for biblical study and comparison. Then, in 1844, the world of biblical scholarship was shaken by the dramatic discovery of the Codex Sinaiticus by Constantin von Tischendorf at St. Catherine's Monastery in the Sinai Desert. This manuscript, hidden for centuries, provided new insights and readings that had been lost to time, showing many discrepancies to the received text. This timeline of discoveries makes it clear the translators of the King James Bible simply could not have consulted these ancient manuscripts. Their work was based on the best sources available to them at the time, but many crucial documents were still hidden or unknown. Instead, the King James translators relied on later medieval manuscripts, completely unaware of the different readings and textual variations preserved in these supposed ancient codices. Their translation reflects the knowledge and limitations of their era, highlighting the ever-evolving nature of biblical scholarship and discovery. Codex Alexandrinus' journey to England is linked to Cyril Lucar, a Greek Orthodox cleric influenced by the Protestant Reformation. Lucar, seeking an alliance with Protestant England, gifted the manuscript to King James I, though it was presented to King Charles I in 1627. This placed a vital biblical manuscript in the hands of English scholars, becoming a key resource for textual criticism. Despite Lucar's tragic end, his legacy endures through Codex Alexandrinus. Despite not having the big three manuscripts, the King James translators weren't entirely in the dark. Knowledge traveled through letters, notes, and printed Greek New Testaments with annotations. Desiderius Erasmus' printed Greek New Testament, the Textus Receptus, was their primary source. Marginal notes in these editions hinted at variant readings from ancient sources. Scholars shared information about Codex Vaticanus readings, even if indirectly. The translators were aware of textual variations, though they lacked the manuscripts to fully assess them. When the translators of the King James Version set out to create their English Bible in the early 17th century, they relied heavily on a Greek text known as the Textus Receptus. This text was itself compiled from a collection of later Byzantine manuscripts, which were the most widely available at the time. The translators worked diligently, but their resources were limited to what had survived and circulated in Western Europe. These Byzantine manuscripts had been copied and recopied over centuries and preserved by the Church in the wilderness, often by hands in the hidden caves of the Waldensians and other secluded groups. Because of this repeated copying, the manuscripts were preserved. They were similar to each other, resulting in a standardized text that was trusted by many. This process also meant that there were less errors or additions made. Like the newer manuscripts, errors along the way were likely to be repeated in subsequent copies of the newer manuscripts found. When scholars later compared the King James Version and its underlying manuscripts to supposed much older codices, such as the Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus, they discovered thousands of differences in these manuscripts compared to the Textus Receptus. These ancient manuscripts, dating back to the 4th century, often contained shorter or alternate readings, raising questions about which versions were closest to the originals. Some of these differences are quite significant. For example, the famous story of the woman caught in adultery, found in the Gospel of John, is missing from these newfound earlier manuscripts. These supposed ancient copies have blank spaces where the story would later appear, suggesting it was added in later centuries. Another notable example is the Johannine comma, a brief but important Trinitarian phrase in 1 John. This passage, which affirms the doctrine of the Trinity, is absent from these known Greek manuscripts before the 15th century, indicating it was likely a later addition to the text. The King James translators included these passages not out of deception, but because they were present in the manuscripts available to them. Their work reflected the best scholarship and resources of their era, but as more ancient manuscripts have come to light, our understanding of the Bible's textual history continues to evolve. The King James translators aimed to create a dignified, accurate English Bible for the Church of England. They worked with the Textus Receptus, lacking a methodology that prioritized newer manuscripts. Modern translators use critical Greek texts, weighing evidence from thousands of manuscripts. The King James translators engaged in textual criticism, aware of some textual problems in the newer manuscripts. They consulted different editions of the Textus Receptus and ancient translations, noting variations in marginal notes. Did the King James translators know about the Big Three's readings? Not directly, but they weren't entirely unaware. They hadn't seen Sinaiticus or Vaticanus and hadn't studied Alexandrinus. However, through scholarly networks, they knew of textual variations. Earlier editors like Erasmus highlighted some issues, and annotations mentioned absent verses in these supposed ancient copies. The translators were aware of textual uncertainties, making informed choices with the evidence they had. The debate continues, touching on inspiration and preservation of Scripture, but the King James translators did their best with available resources.